So now that we've taken a look at how the gateway is structured and Eureka is structured, let's walk through the code that actually implements this. And you'll see this is going to be pretty fast because there's not a lot of code to look at here. And that's because it is almost completely boilerplate code. So this is where you can find what we're about to look at, my EX4 project in my web MVC folder in my live lessons GitHub repository. So here we are in the project for the EX4 app case study, and we're going to look at the gateway portion right there. And if we peek around here, you're going to see that we have a couple different pieces. Here is the gateway application. And if you take a careful look at this, you can see that it's just a normal application. It's a Spring Boot application. We're going to have a main method that will run the gateway application. And just for kicks, we're going to do a few things here to print out the properties of the gateway so when it runs, we can actually see what it's been configured to do. And we'll see how it gets configured here in just a second. So that's what the gateway application looks like. It's pretty much a generic Spring application. Here's the gateway controller. Once again, you can see it's super duper simple. And the main thing it does is it has a method called info, which is going to listen here at the slash. So if you send a request to the slash or to actuator info, either of those various routes, it will end up sending back an indication in response saying that this particular controller is alive, and here's where it's running. That's mostly just for debugging purposes. So this is what's used in order to be able to test to see whether the gateway is up and running. And there are various situations under which that might be a useful thing. If we take a look down here, let's take a look at the YAML files that we have. So this is the YAML file for the API gateway. As you can see, it's going to listen at port 880. It's the gateway, and you have to set it to be reactive, even though it's largely under the hood using the synchronous mechanisms to implement the client get and post requests, but it's used for reactive. You need to say that, otherwise the gateways don't work for whatever reason. And we have logging level set to debug. So you can see that's pretty much every gateway looks something like this. And then here we have the actual information about what capabilities are provided by this gateway. And this is where we're actually declaratively programming what it's going to be doing. And you'll see here in this particular case that I use my good friend ChatGPT to fill in explanations about what all these different directives mean inside the configuration for application path YAML. And you can see here that this basically says we're going to match all the routes, and this is for being able to do various cross-origin policies. And we're only going to allow things from this port number to come in. Here's where we're saying what HTTP methods are allowed. And you can see that we use get and post methods. And then down here we have content type. We're allowing content type headers. Down here we're specifying the route, which in this case is the handy microservice. And this is indicating where this particular request should be forwarded. Now, what's interesting to note for this particular example, we don't actually use the Eureka microservice here for sophisticated things. Instead, what we're doing here is we're hard coding the microservices to listen on these ports. We'll show how to use the microservice, Eureka microservice, in a later example. This is the part that is going to be looked for in an incoming get or post request, and we strip that off before forwarding the request to the microservice, in this case to the handy microservice. So you can see it's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of complicated things going on there. And if we go down here, this is getting ahead of ourselves, but I just want to show you something real quick. If we take a look at the microservices in the resources portion, you can see that they have an application YAML file. And the application YAML file for our microservices say to run the handy microservice at this port number, 9100 and 9101 for Zippy. And if you go back over here, you can see that that's what we had specified there. So it says Handy's listening there, and Zippy is listening there. So this particular use of this feature, of this particular example, doesn't use Eureka, but it's quite easy to make it work with Eureka. And in fact, we will make it work with Eureka shortly when we look at a different variant that uses WebFlux. Keep in mind, however, that using WebFlux versus WebMVC with respect to this stuff they're basically the same thing. You can use them in either way. Okay, so that's pretty much all there is to show because there's not a lot of code written for doing the API gateway. As you can see, this is very, very boilerplate code. We just have to kind of fill it in to do the minimal set of things, and that's pretty much copy and paste from each microservice, unless you have something, or each case study, unless you have something drastically different, which we don't in this case.